I've seen so
Mm.
much weird art, and I'm like, I don't know if the artist is worried about how I'm encountering
Yes.
it. It doesn't,
Yeah.
or I'm like, I don't think they care. But I'm like,
Yeah.
when I got to it, and I'm like, I don't think they wanted me to understand.
Yeah.
I appreciate poets who have that consideration. Like, how is the people that are going to actually encounter my work going to sit with it? I
Yeah.
appreciate not just a text where not necessarily a text where I feel confused, because that's not always what it is, but I appreciate a text that asks me to do more than just look at it once.
Yeah.
Hello, poets of the internet. I'm Diesel Carson, and this is O Word, the podcast interested in craft, poets, their obsessions, and the things that keep them writing. Today's episode is O Nonce. I'm here today with my pressmate, Nick Martino. Nick Martino is a poet and teacher from Milwaukee. His debut poetry collection, Scrapbook, from Alice James Books, won the 2024 Alice James Editor's Choice Award and will be published in June of 2026. His poems have been published in Best New Poets, Narrative, Ninth Letter, the Boston Review, and the Southern Review, among others. A finalist for the 2024 Swanee Review Poetry Prize, he holds an MFA from the University of California, Irvine, where he received the 2022 Excellence in Poetry Prize. He lives in LA. Nick, hello.
Hello. So good to be here. Thanks so much for having me on, Diesel.
Of course, thank you for being on. It's so nice to be having a more extended conversation with you. I've been really excited for your book.
I'm so excited for yours as well. It's an honor to be pressmates with you. I'm
Thank
really,
you.
really
Thank you. I
blessed.
appreciate it. Yeah. I keep telling people how in love I am with your book's cover.
Oh my God. Yeah. Alice James did such an amazing job. I love it. This beautiful
It's
collage work by this Australian artist named Lizzie Buckmaster Dove, who's just incredible. I'm very lucky.
Yeah, something that I've been enjoying, and I think this will segue us well into the episode, is I've been really enjoying like thinking about how your cover really reflects what's happening inside of the book. Also a
Hmm.
reflection of the title itself being scrapbook, but like that as also a clear indication for what we might encounter inside of the book. Because I know your book has some really fun visual stuff going on.
Yes. Yeah.
Um,
Absolutely.
and so thinking about that and thinking about kind of the innovations that you've been taking inside of your book, this is first and foremost a learning podcast. Try to teach people new terms, new words. And today we are thinking about nonce forms, which is a term that I think I only learned like a year or two ago.
Yeah.
It's so I would love if you could tell the people what nonce forms are.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm so excited to talk about this. And I have to begin by confessing that nonce form is a term that I only learned maybe a year and a half ago, actually.
Okay,
After
so
I've been
right around the
writing
same
nonce
time, yeah.
forms. Yeah, like right around the same
Yeah.
time as you, someone pitched an AWP panel to me that didn't end up getting picked up about the employment of nonce forms. And I was like, yeah, thank you so much. Absolutely. What is a nonce form? I don't actually
What the hell is that?
know. What is that? Yeah. And they're like, oh, it's what you've been doing. And I go, oh, thank you for furnishing me with language for what I've been doing, which I've been just striking out in the dark, have no idea what I'm doing. But what I've come to understand what a nonce form is that it's a form created to fit one particular need. So a kind of one-time form that's created to address a particular topic that the poet wants to bring up. And so we have the traditional forms of the sonnet, the villanelle, the sestina, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then the nonce form, which is for a one-time use. But all traditional forms started out as nonce forms.
Yeah, the one I always think of is the golden shovel.
Yes,
Like
yeah,
Terrence
absolutely.
Hayes made the golden shovel for this particular poem, and then other people were like, "That's sick. Let me do that."
Yeah, I
And
want to
so
do that
now it's
too.
like a form.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think of
yeah,
the
that's
duplex by Jericho Brown, that
mm-hmm.
beautiful form that has the repetition in couplets. The first line of
Yeah.
one couplet is the previous line, or a kind of play off of, or repetition, near repetition of the previous line. And
Yeah,
they
it's like a
kind of move.
sonnet pantone,
Yeah,
like it's doing a lot of
call and
different
response kind
stuff.
of thing. And now that's become a tremendously, yeah, I have a duplex in my book, in Scrapbook, actually, too. And so it's taken on its own
Oh,
life and
great.
moved beyond the scope of Jericho's amazing book, The Tradition, where I think he debuted that form.
Are there other, we've already just talked about Terrence and Jericho. Are there any other like existing nonce forms that you're already a fan of? Or
Yeah.
I'll even say like ones that like spoke to you, like, oh, it's cool to see a poet doing something like for this project.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that some of my favorite poets play with nonce forms, or I'm just very captivated by the nonce form. I think of Diana Coy Wynne, who
Mm,
in her book Ghost of has the triptych poems that
right.
take family photographs and then write into the spaces that have been cut out of those based upon that particular biography and like right around it. I think of Layli Long Soldier's Whereas, which
Hmm.
is replicating the language in that congressional resolution of apology to Native Americans in this satirical or scathing kind of way. Her poem 38 as
Yes.
well, which
Hmm.
right is featured within that book. It's a lot of Layli Long Soldier's poems. I was just reading one of our pressmates' books, Ron Villanueva's A Holy Dread, which just came out with
Hmm.
Alex James, R.A. Villanueva.
Yes.
Incredible poet, incredible person, incredible book. He has a poem, one of my favorites within the book itself. I'm forgetting the name of it, but it's a kind of play he wrote in the notes off of Layli Long Soldier's Obligations 2, which is a poem that I bet a lot of
Yeah,
our
that
your
tree
listeners will be familiar
diagram.
with. Yeah, that you can
Hmm.
read it through in various different ways, kind of like a garden path methodology or of approach. I think Solma Sharif plays with the nonce quite a bit as well. I think her first book, Look, is playing with
Hmm.
that dictionary of military terms and yeah, employing those in her writing as well. Dinez, their book Bluff, opens with the anti-poetica. It's kind of like an ars poetica, which feels like a play on a nonce form as well. Before I sat down today, I was looking through all of my poetry books and trying to pick out other, like, oh yeah, this one and that one. And I came across Olio by Tahimba Jess, which I think is
Hmm.
so incredible in its use of the like playing with existing forms and building off of existing forms. One of my favorite poems in the book is the or series in the book is that talks about I think it's the McKay sisters, the conjoined twins, and
Hmm.
he writes in these contrapuntals, but then he makes
Oh, yes,
of the
yes. Oh my God.
contrapuntals
Yes.
this
Yeah, yeah,
giant
yeah.
page that folds out. It's mind boggling. It's such an incredible book and project. Yeah. Most recently, I just read Alice Notley's Descent of Alette, which is this really
Oh.
long epic poem. Like her project was to feature a woman as opposed to a man, which typically is centered within the epic tradition. And
Mm,
also, she's playing with the epic form because they're varying lengths, the poems themselves, across the entirety of the novel in verse or however you might describe it, but they all engage with quotation marks, and there are like certain phrases or periods that are encapsulated within quotation marks. And I think she has a note where she's gesturing towards the tradition, the oral tradition of the epic, and allowing those quotation marks to syncopate certain beats for the reading of it. It's this cool, crazy project that I loved reading as well. So yeah, I could go on and on. Torne Great House's Burning Heiben too,
yes,
which
that's another one that's like
yeah.
those nonce forms is now just becoming like a form, like a traditional
Yes,
form,
right. That's another
which is
one. Yeah,
kind of
like
beautiful to
duplex.
see. Obviously, I love when poets like make a thing and they're like, it's mine. But I also love seeing like a form catch on because it
Yeah,
like, has activated something within people. And I
right.
think the Burning Hyben is one of those forms that it just captures a very particular energy about like loss or erasure or like I've written
Mm,
two actually. They're two separate ones, but they're both thinking about memory. But I wrote one thinking about my
mm.
mother who passed away recently
Oh, I'm
from an
sorry.
illness. I appreciate it. But just thinking about like the that what's nice about the burning hyben for anyone who hasn't doesn't know what a hyben or a burning hyben is. So a hyben
Mhm,
is basically a long-ish prose block followed by a haiku, and a burning hyben is a hyben that then erases itself down into a haiku, which
mm,
is like a nice change in that form. And so what it's nice about that is an excavation of language from language that's already created by the poet. But
mm,
what I was thinking about when I was writing it was just thinking about like the inability, like I've said so much, and then there's like less and less that I'm able to say. Like it has to be
mm, mhm,
encapsulated down into this like core feeling,
mm.
and that's something that I felt was really, really well done with the Burning Hyben.
Yeah.
There's something about the element of visual poetics that touches on something that language itself cannot necessarily
Mhm,
capture. Like when I'm
mhm,
thinking about Diana Coywin's triptych, what strikes me, besides obviously her verse is great, like her language is
mhm,
great, but what also gets me is like the literal shape of the poems, either in the shape of the missing brother or it's shaped around his absence, right? So it's either
yes,
filling
exactly.
in or filling around that space. And there's
Mhm.
something that visual poetic is communicating to me that I wouldn't get if I wasn't looking at it. And I'm wondering like what you think about kind of those ideas of visual poetics.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up. And whenever I'm thinking about visual poetics or talking about visual poetics with others, I think about this podcast with Paul Tran, who's an amazing poet. I believe they said it was Denise Levertov who said, so this is through by like from Denise Levertov by way of Paul Tran. You read or Denise apparently said in this workshop, you read the poem before you read the poem. Meaning, when
Mm,
you as a reader encounter it on the page, regardless of whether or not it's engaging with an explicit visual tradition or visual poetics or not, the shape of it, its arrangement upon the page, the way in which the poet is using or not using white space says something about the poem.
mm,
Like, we're visual creatures, we're inclined towards taking in that kind of visual data and coming to some sort of conclusion, be it explicit or implicit, before we necessarily encounter the content of what's being said. So I just think of the visual medium within a poem as another way to perhaps emphasize or highlight or say something that the poem in its content is already saying. A kind of doubling of, yeah, of what is being denoted or connoted. And it can emphasize what's being said, it can undercut what's being said. And so I think that, like, to bringing up the triptychs that Diana Coy Wynn's poems within Ghost of, makes me think about how seeing the arrangement of words on the page in the shape of the kind of cutout of her brother
mm.
does more than just providing those words that fill in that space upon the page in a kind of normal way. There's something like haunting about it, gesturing towards this form or this shape. So it's just another way to include additional data or an additional atmosphere or mood or feeling atop what's already
Yeah.
being said.
Yeah, something about that impression, right? The impression of the brother upon the text and the way that
Mhm.
his shape kind of moves with us. Claudia Emerson has this terrific poem that I talk about all the time called Artifact.
Write that
And it's
down.
from her collection, Late Wife. And in this particular poem, she's talking about this man that she's with. She has recently divorced her ex-husband and she's now with a new partner. And
Mm.
this new partner's wife has passed away, which is the late wife
Mm.
that the collection is thinking about. But basically, in the poem, she's thinking about the energy that this wife has left behind. And there's this, I'm just going to read like this part of the poem that I'm thinking about, right?
Yeah, please.
So it says, "You told me you gave it all away, then sold the house, keeping only the confirmation cross she wore, her name in cursive chase on the gold underside, your ring in the same box, those photographs you still avoid, and the quilt you spread on your borrowed bed. Small things. Months after we met, you told me she had made it, after we had already slept beneath its loft and thinning, raveled pattern, as though beneath her shadow, moving with us, that dark,
Mhm.
that soft."
Mhm.
And so I'm thinking about that shadow that we're thinking of, like
Mhm.
moving
Mhm.
with us. That's the sense I get when I think when I'm reading a triptych, but just like how is that person haunting the narrative? It's not a prose class, but nonetheless.
Mhm. Yeah.
But yeah, so those are all things that I'm thinking about, which is now going to bring me to your nonce form,
Mm.
the Polaroid. I would love if one, you could just tell us more about this form, what prompted it, what was your process for deciding its rules, were there other things that helped to inform it? Because like when I'm looking at it or thinking about it, I'm already thinking of burning Hybens, maybe in reverse or
Sure.
something
Yeah,
like that.
absolutely.
So yeah, tell us about how that came to be.
Yeah, so the Burning Hybrid was really foundational for my approach to the Polaroid form, which I fell into, honestly, into writing, in part because I was in the third year of my MFA at the time that I first started writing these. And I was writing a lot about my father's history of incarceration and the effect that it had on our family and the way in which I found out about this history because he had been imprisoned prior to me being born. And so this
Mm,
was something that kind of came out slowly over the course of a decade and a half, essentially. I think
mm,
I was 16 when he first told me about this history. And it's something that I really repressed because at the time I had a very unnuanced or unsophisticated understanding of prison in general and who would go to prison. And so I was trying to write into and through that experience and that history. And I was home taking care of my mother, and she did the very classic family or I don't know, mother thing, which was like, "Oh, have I ever told you about those photographs that we have of your father when he was in prison?" So, like,
yeah.
she kind of referenced them as if I knew full well all
We're
about them. I
very
was like, "Wait, hold on,
casually.
hold on." Yeah, very casually. And then so the Polaroids of your father in prison. I was like, "Wait, hold on, stop." you're telling me that there's actual visual evidence of this time period that I've been thinking nonstop about, that I've been talking to you endlessly about. This is a history that I talk quite a lot about with my mother. And she's, oh yeah, the Polaroids, the photos. And I was like, please, let's find those. And so she was able to excavate those out from the attic. And there are 9 Polaroid photographs of my father and my mother as well on select visitation days of his. And I just was fascinated by these photographs. I couldn't stop looking at them. My father was not too much older than I currently am at the time of taking those photographs, and
Mm,
seeing this window into the past was just fascinating and saddening, and I really just was obsessed with them, and I just
mm,
wanted to spend some time looking at them. And because I was in the middle of writing a kind of full length thesis and trying to figure out, I don't know, just how to address this history, I thought, let me just sit down with these Polaroids and write ekphrastic poems about the photographs themselves.
yeah.
And honestly, too, what I needed like a daily little break from one-on-one mom and son time a little bit as well. So I
Mm,
was like, all right, I have a project for myself. Every day I'm going to spend 2 hours in this coffee shop that's right next door to her apartment. And I'm going to sit down and I'm just going to look at the Polaroid
mm,
and write about what I see. And as I was starting with that premise or that project, I was thinking about the actual concrete object of the Polaroid itself and the idea
mhm,
of the Polaroid developing. That kind of process was made plain to me as well, because there are certain spots on certain Polaroids that like didn't fully develop, these kind of
mhm,
little like marks or dings that didn't really fully come out. So it's made manifest the process of development on the actual object itself. And so I was thinking too about how, and I was writing a lot about how when I first learned about this family history, I had this really unnuanced or unsophisticated understanding of it. And I really didn't know a lot of the whole, like a lot of the pertinent details, like how long he was even in prison for, what exactly was the nature of what he was in prison for, all of these things. And steadily over the course of, I don't know, a decade and a half following my father first telling me about this history, like little details started to fill in. And I don't know when it first happened, but I just made a connection between the Polaroid and things filling in and developing within a Polaroid, and the way
yeah.
in which like details fill in these around a certain
Like
family
that
history.
revelation. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And for
Yeah.
me, it
Yeah.
wasn't like it was a revelation, but it was like a long or a slow revelation. We talk about
Mm-mm-mm.
epiphany, like these aha moments. For me, it was this kind of period of 10 years that I was
Yeah.
wrestling with, not actively every single day, but coming to terms with the way in which this carceral history kind of predetermined certain elements of my life. Like my parents divorced when I was in 8th grade. I grew up in this household that was tremendously contentious. There was a lot of silence and fighting and like hushed conversations behind closed doors. And I have a lot of memories of that, but I had no idea as to what was the nature of these things that they were fighting about. And coming to an understanding like 5, 6, 7 years later, oh my God, this history of incarceration
Mm,
prefigured their eventual kind of the collapse of this relationship and of our family in some ways. And so I thought to myself, okay, well, what if I play with that idea on the page, the idea of how like I have only certain details at first around this family history, and then more things fill in, and it'll be like filling in like the way a Polaroid fills in. And I think I wrote the Polaroid poems first as erasures, or I wrote them with the gaps, basically.
mhm.
And so I would be like, and then the blank color of the blank was so blank. And I wrote those, and I wrote a few, and I was like, this is so contrived. This is not working. This doesn't work. This doesn't make any kind of sense. Like, I'm just fabricating absences. And so they didn't really
Mhm,
feel real to me. And so I thought, okay, what if my methodology is wrong here? I like still really love the idea of a slow kind of filling in of
mhm,
details. But what if I began writing the kind of fully developed image that
mhm,
gestures towards not only what's happening within the photograph, but I was really interested in, or I felt like there was a lot of heat when I was writing about my looking at the photograph too. Like, what was
yeah.
I surprised at when I first encountered the photograph? What was my eye drawn to? What detail only emerged after repeated viewings? What is something that surprised me or I disliked about the photograph? Like thinking about my positionality as a viewer of the photograph was more interesting to me almost than what was actually physically at play. So I said, okay, what if I write the full thing first and then erase the Polaroid from there and
Mhm.
present the erasures first so that the poem fills in over the course of 2 or 3 or 4 even pages.
Mm.
And then that's how it came to be. It was honestly a project or an idea that took months, if not a year or a year and a half.
I think very similar to the first one. That was my approach to writing my Burning Haibens. The way I would go about writing the Burning Haiben is I start with the haiku. And so
Oh,
I'm
interesting.
like, these are the words. And what I'll do is I'll write the haiku, but I'm trying to write not like a perfectly congruent sentence necessarily, or I
Hmm.
understand that in order for it to be a proper erasure, it has to arrange in a way that may not be like perfectly grammatically correct, whatever.
Hmm. Yeah.
But I start with the haiku and then I build language around that.
Oh, wow.
And
That's
the reason
fascinating.
I the yeah, and the reason I do that is just if I know what I'm going to get to, I just know these words have to be in these words have to appear in the original text in this
Hmm.
order to get the haiku that I want.
Yeah. You're like,
Because
where
to
are
me
we
that was
arriving at?
actually yeah, because to me that was the actual I was on the opposite end of like where I really wanted the heat, and for me I really wanted the
Mm.
heat in that like what it was being erased down to. And so I was just like, yeah, I need it to come together this way. I'll throw these words at the wall and then I'll build the bricks around this
Mm.
language.
Yeah.
I think they're both really interesting like ways into it, because I mean what I really appreciate about, and this is maybe a triumph of digital poetics, but like when I see your Polaroid poems online, I
Mm.
get to see the actual like development of the
Yes.
text
Yeah.
into that full quote unquote Polaroid. I'm like, wow,
Mm.
this is exactly the way that it's supposed to look, and this is how the way it's supposed to feel.
Yeah.
With it being in a physical book,
Mm.
obviously I can't unless some magic about the presses that Alice Chase is
Yeah.
working with. It's obviously not doing that same development thing. How do you
Right.
feel like that changes, if at all, the energy of how the poems are encountered? Do you prefer them being encountered one way versus the other?
That's a great question. Yeah, and it's something I've been thinking a lot about, and I think it began with a conversation again, another podcast. I think these were both podcast conversations on verses, and I think it was a conversation with Era Matthews, and she was
Oh,
talking
mm-hmm.
about limitations that a physical paper book holds, and
Mm-hmm.
she was saying something like maybe in the future books will have batteries, and like we'll be able to actually have something that kind of like moves on the page, or maybe in the future, like I think she has this idea of, or this example, this kind of hypothesis or hypothetical around you walk into a gallery space and the book is projected on the walls and you read
Mm-hmm.
it and encounter it in that way. So just allowing us or asking us, inviting us to think about different ways of engagement with text.
Yeah, the
And that
possibilities.
conversation, I think, yeah, all those possibilities was at the back of my mind when I first sent some of these Polaroid poems. I think it was originally the Los Angeles Review.
Mm-hmm.
And I was at that time listening to that conversation with Aaron Matthews and thinking to myself, like, what if I made a version of this that could be presented in a book with batteries, so to speak? What if I made an animation? And so I sent these poems to the Los Angeles Review, and the editor, Brent Amanero, he wrote back to me, and he was someone who was interested in video poetics, or yeah, cinematic
Mm.
poetry, or these video poems as well. And he was like, oh, here's how I might imagine doing this. And it was a collaborative project to animate these poems in this way. And I figured out how to do it in PowerPoint. And when I came to that iteration of the Polaroid poem, I was so excited to see, yeah, like here's the manifestation of the development like actually happening before your eyes. And I think there's something interesting about, if it's a GIF, having to sit with it and
Mm.
perhaps not catching all of the information at first, and perhaps having to
Yes.
sit through 2 or 3 cycles of it. So on the one hand, I was like, is it maybe an issue that I'm making this poem more difficult to read for people? Like poetry already, there is perhaps a higher barrier to entry for certain people. But then I was like, no,
Mm-hmm.
there's something cool about asking or inviting someone to sit down and spend some time with this piece in this way. So I really loved that aspect of it, that you might not catch everything in the GIF and have to sit through multiple cycles. But
Yeah.
then when I think about the actual poem on the page, I think there's something really lovely in the way in which it becomes then a kind of twofold arrangement where I'm providing for the reader the Polaroid as it's developing on the page, but it's up to the reader to flip the page and kind of
Right.
develop it themselves. Like the difference between putting a vinyl record on itself
Yeah.
versus like hitting a button and it plays for you. So I like the way in which there will be actually in the book itself an invitation for the reader to develop the Polaroid as they
Yeah,
used
we've
to.
gone from like the reader with the Polaroid picture to the reader who's in the dark room themselves,
Yeah.
turning yeah, to actually turning it, making sure that it's developing properly. You know, if
Yeah,
they
right.
skip a page, right, then they've gone past a
Hmm.
part of the development. Like, how does that mess it
Totally.
up?
Yes.
If they
And
skip a
more in the
page
visual
and they
meta.
don't get to that final, for some reason they skip that final fully rendered photo, like thinking about like
Yeah.
the things that like the possibilities of human error, but then the other
Sure.
ways that invites new kinds of interpretation. Like, what if someone stopped at the second page of
Yeah.
the Polaroid, right? And they were like, that's all I'm going to read from it. And that's going to
Hmm.
be my,
I
for
love that
whatever
idea.
reason.
Wow. Yeah. Because all of a sudden there's a million new opportunities or ways to read this poem. It has now instantly, yeah, 100 million, as many ways as you can think of, different kind of avenues of exploring it in that way. Out of my
Yeah.
hands. I can't, there's nothing I can do at this point, you know,
Yeah. Which is
which
really
is
maybe,
cool.
especially with like debuts, right? This is like, you get really precious about this thing that we've made. And we're like, this is so cool. And now other people get to do it, like, fuck all with it, do whatever
Yeah.
they want
Right.
with this. I had a
Totally.
conversation with K.E. Bancroft. They have a new book coming out through Sundress Publications,
Yeah.
Blood Room.
Blood Room, right? Yeah. I'm excited for
Yeah,
that.
yeah. And we had a conversation earlier on this podcast about hybridity and like what
Cool.
just like the possibilities of visual poetics, messing with other things, getting funky, you know, and like
Yes. Yeah.
what does it mean for us to engage with other texts with a poetic eye? I think poetry is like a nice, fun genre because it can really be
Hmm.
anything it wants.
Yeah.
Uh, and the way that I
No
always
rules.
explain poetry to other people, exactly. Yeah, I'm like, poetry to me is anything that engages in some type of rhetorical experimentation with text. It's
No,
basically
I like that.
anything that's asking you to engage. And I say text, like I do say it has to be textual in some sort, but
Mm.
it's asking you to engage with a text in some way outside of how we would usually encounter language. So I think like our
Hmm.
traditional forms fit that nicely because we're not usually talking in rhyme.
Mm.
And so if a
Mm.
poem's rhyming, like that's a different kind of non-usual engagement of text. That's rhetorical experimentation. But
Got
that
it.
also goes
Interesting.
up to things like Lately Long Soldier turning the poem into the obligations to, or it
Yeah.
becomes like when you're doing erasure, like Nicole Seeley doing an erasure of this very long Ferguson report, right?
Hmm.
Or if we're doing these pantoums, or we're doing like you're doing these Polaroids, develop poems that develop over time. Like these are not how we usually encounter text. We usually encounter text in forms and
Hmm.
applications and
Mm.
brochures and
Mm.
military
Like
propaganda
copy.
and yeah,
Yeah.
copy, exactly. And so when we're
Hmm.
thinking about poetry, we're thinking about how are we estranging that
Mm.
relationship, right, in some
Mm.
way. And so I love everything that makes me do that.
I love that
Um,
definition. I'm going to hold on to that definition because so
yeah,
many people
I'm
will
trying
ask
to
me,
like
what makes poetry as opposed to prose? And I'm like, that's a great question. And honestly, like the only answer I've ever been able to engage with is it's doing something either purposely or not vis-a-vis like lineation. It's attending to the
yeah,
line in a way different than prose. But I don't know. That's always been for me like a not
that was
fully
a
satisfying definition. So I like yours a lot.
yeah,
And I
and
like
that was
how
a
it,
big struggle for me.
yeah. Yeah, I know.
That's
So
why I
like
had to
how,
come up
yeah,
with one.
yeah, it's like the first day of poetry instruction. Yeah, because I'm a high school English teacher, and they're like, "Okay,
Hmm.
what is poetry?" And I'm like, "We could spend the entirety of the class talking about that." And I
Yeah.
hope I can show you things that expand your notion as to what poetry can be. And that's what I love about your definition, which is that it's engaging with the idea of surprise, which is one of the
Hmm.
most favorite things that a poem can engender in me, which is surprise. And I think that it's
Yeah.
that at this point, like really old hat, like advice, but like the kind of phrase that everyone bandies about, which is like a good poem surprises the reader and a great poem surprises the poet. And that
Hmm.
idea of reading and writing alongside or adjacent to the notion of surprise just makes it more fun too, right?
Yeah.
Like I'm always chasing pleasure when I'm writing. I'm chasing experimentation and irreverence, even if the subject matter is weighty. And perhaps at times I'm leaning less so into irreverence than others, depending upon the
Hmm.
subject matter. But that at least is what it allows for, I don't know, me to keep coming back. The ability that I have to hopefully surprise myself in some way or to engage in text in a non-traditional kind of format like you described.
Yeah. Yeah. Basically came up with it because I had the same issue. People ask me what poems are, and I have the Essential Poets Glossary next to me
Mm.
at my desk, and it's yeah, a poem is poetry definitions are like, yeah, a poem is not prose unless it's a prose poem, or
Right. Yeah.
a poem
Right.
is not
Exactly.
music unless it has music said to it. So it's all these
Yeah.
things. And I was like, I need to have something that is, it's not just poetry isn't, because I hate
Right.
this thing is not answer. And so for me, it was just like, yeah, I think anytime I think about poetry, It's a poem. And I like this. I use this definition because it also takes away the idea that whether or not it's doing it on purpose, my relationship to
Mm-hmm.
language is now different.
Cool.
The last question I'll ask you is if someone wanted to approach doing their own nonce form, how should they start?
So how to approach a nonce poem? I think that when I was thinking about this question, I was thinking about this experience I had in workshop once where I got a poem back from a mentor of mine. And at the top of the poem, she had written in huge block letters, form equals content. And I was confused about it until I went in and I talked with her a little bit more. And what she was trying to say was that the form that I had engaged in with this poem didn't really do anything to further the message or to undermine the message or to highlight the message. Like it was an arbitrary decision to say put it into couplets or tercets or something like that. And
Mm,
she felt as if it wasn't really necessarily doing anything to further an underlying message or idea or atmosphere. And so I guess I ask you, dear listener, to consider like what shape or rhetoric or syntax on the page might help emphasize what you're trying to say, or perhaps undermine what you're trying to say in some way to come in conflict with it. Like, how can you employ the kind of blank canvas of the white page, the 8.5 by 11 or however big piece of paper you want to use, that's in some way gestures towards a kind of emotional valence that the poem you're trying to capture within the poem. And I think that's perhaps easier said than done. Oh yeah, just consider what how form equals content. But I think maybe taking a step back from that, I think first and foremost, what you have to be willing to do is to just play around with things and to allow yourself to play
mhm,
around with things and to understand that your experiments in writing might not pan out in any kind of way. You might scrap it, you might never see the light of day, but you have to become less precious, or I had to become less precious with my own writing so as to give myself the space to dream up and grow into this form that became the Polaroid poem. I had to sit for a long time with the discomfort of, oh, I like this idea, or oh, this is a fun idea, but the way that I'm evoking it on the page is not doing it justice and it's not working right now. And I had to become less precious and more willing to experiment and play. I think that like nonce forms, I was thinking about nonce and I was thinking about how I used to be an assistant first grade teacher during one of
mm.
the most happy periods of my life. It was a great job that maybe one day I'll go back to. But I think about like nonce forms and like the way that kids play on the playground. They're
Mhm.
inventing rules for themselves. They're saying, okay, this is lava, but this is safe. Then you can't do this, but you have to do that. And they're coming it up with it typically together. Maybe there's one leader, but they're like giving themselves these parameters in which to play. And I think that there's something interesting about how sometimes for poets, or at least for me, giving one self constraints, okay, only 10 lines or only lines of this length or only engaging in this kind of syntax or this kind of rhetoric or vocab, the constraint can actually be freeing or liberating. Because at least for me, it can actually make me, it gives me something to bounce off of and have ideas
Yeah.
upon, basically.
Yeah.
So I think, yeah, a willingness to play and experiment and a lack of preciousness with like ensuring, oh, this has to be the perfect iteration of this kind of idea. And thinking about how visually on the page, before you even read the actual content of what's being said, what are you saying already to the reader?
Experiment's a fun way to think about that too, I think. Just the idea
Hmm.
that like the point of an experiment is never actually the end result, it's the process. It reminds us like the purpose isn't necessarily to succeed or fail because the point of an experiment is to learn what's happening and to observe
Hmm.
what's happening. We're not making a product. We
Right.
might succeed or we might fail, but we're learning something every time.
Yeah.
And that's really
You have to
helpful.
have fun in the process of it in that way. Yeah.
Yeah,
Enjoying the
great.
process.
Nick, this has been a terrific conversation. Thank you so much for telling us about nonce forms and telling us about your nonce form. And to close this out, I would love if you could read a poem that demonstrates your nonce form.
Yes, absolutely. So this is Polaroid Prison Visit, June 7th, 1989. My mother turning to the prison. He lied. I can't stop staring at his face, dark cement. the silhouette behind the blood in her hand, humming his touch, her hands grasping in his, a gesture of fear. My mother turning to the camera, she's glowing, and my father's in prison. Heavy mascara carefully applied, I can't stop staring at. I imagine her hardened to stone, this face rain dark cement, the prison yard silhouette, the figure behind the blood in my father's hand, a hummingbird, his touch, a judgment of her distance. And yet I can't ignore her hands grasping in his, a gesture of love or fear. My mother turning to the camera, her hair a starving argument of red. I'm surprised that she's smiling, rosy, almost glowing. It's the afternoon, and my father's in prison. Heavy mascara carefully applied, a hospital bright blouse, her tanned hand sleeping on his knee. I can't stop staring at her white teeth. Behind them, I imagine her grief is a cherry pit hardened to stone. Imagining her frame of mind, do I deceive myself? What do I know? Only this realm of surfaces, the vomit-colored lawn, the rain-dark cement. In the furthest corner of the prison yard, a silhouette watching the camera. Watching, too, I feel as figment as the figure behind them, and as close as the blood in my father's hand to the shoulder it hovers over the hummingbird, my mother's body leaning into his touch. I'm leaning too, conjugating witness into a judgment of my father's distance. And yet, I can't ignore the other hand's testimony, grasping her finger in his fist, a gesture of fear indistinguishable from love, or love from fear.
Thank you all for listening to this episode of the O Word podcast produced by me, Diesel Carson. If you are interested in Nonce Forms, I've added some folks recommended by our guests in the Substack post. The music for O Word is provided by Esoteric Creations. Check them out on Spotify. Our guest, Nick, offers the following prompt.
All right, so first, I want you to choose a photograph that's significant to you. Or perhaps choose a photograph that you've always overlooked and that you've actually never really spent some time with. Next, I want you to write a poem in 10 to 12 lines of equal length that describes this photograph. What does it look like? What's happening inside the photograph? Who's there? Who is not there, perhaps? And more than description, what I want you to consider is your gaze itself, your looking itself. As the speaker of the poem looking at the photograph, where is your eye drawn? What is present and what is not present? How do you approach this photograph? Is this a photograph to be looked at when sitting down? Is it one to look at when standing up in a hallway? Where are you approaching this poem or this photograph from all angles, essentially? Now, when you have your 12-line poem, copy and paste it onto the consecutive page of your document. So that's 2 pages perhaps on Word or Google Docs, wherein you have the same block of text replicated twice. Now, on the first page of your document, I want you to begin to erase certain portions of the text. And the way in which you might want to go about erasing is to erase by rendering certain portions of the text white so that you'll preserve the spacing of the Polaroid and the text upon the page. And your eraser methodology is totally up to you. Is there perhaps an embedded narrative within the photograph itself that you want to highlight and draw out in the way of erasure? Perhaps you want to highlight or focus upon those details, those visual details that are most visible to you when first coming to the poem or the photograph itself, considering what narrative you can develop about the photograph or your looking itself across both pages as more details reveal themselves.
Until next time, keep reading, keep writing, and thanks for listening.